This podcast may not be suitable for young listeners.
Chapter 3. Mimic. Who dares wins, who sweats wins, who plans wins. British Special Air Service, SAS. 09:58 hours CST, 13 February, Rocky Lake, Minnesota. 2 minutes to LZ, Captain, said the pilot to Clark. Copy, said Clark, holding up 2 fingers to the rest of the occupants of the transport helicopter. 2 minutes, Team 2, roared Gideon. 2 minutes, Team 4, echoed Captain Hernandez. Teams 2 and 4 of Team Odin were ready to deploy. They were to secure the landing zone, or LZ, for the placement of the mimic units. Their target LZ was a large clearing several hundred yards west of Rocky Lake. Hammer 2-1 to all Hammer units, said the pilot over the radio. We are 2 minutes from target. Stand by for mimic deployment. All units, how copy, over? Hammer 2-2 copies, said a voice. Clark listened as 7 more of the big Chinook helicopters checked in. Hammer 2-3 through Hammer 2-9 all confirmed their compliance. Clark knew that this was going to be critical on the timing, and by the time they had finished dropping the first 8 of the mimic units, the next 4 would already be on their way. The first 8 would form the ground level of the FOB. The next 4 were to lock into place on top of the other 8. The difficult part would be keeping the area secure until the mimics were all in place. Banking around over the lake, Clark got his first look at the snow-covered landscape. While not as rugged as the Ouachita Mountains of Oklahoma, they were no less remote. They were more than 20 miles from the nearest town of any actual size, and only a few miles from the Canadian border. They were all alone out here, and any assistance would only be coming from the air. There wasn't even a logging road for more than 10 miles in any direction. Beginning his descent, Hammer 2-1 brought the big Chinook in over the clearing and touched down in the middle of the area. He was careful to stay well away from the trees, just in case the creature was to take a shot at the aircraft. As soon as the wheels hit the ground, the ramp at the back of the chopper started lowering. "Lock and load," roared Gideon. "Teams 2 and 4, going hot." The sound of numerous charging handles being pulled at the same time filled the air. The ramp lowered to the ground, and the rotor wash was kicking snow up into the air and driving it into their faces and eyes. Clark had planned for that exact thing, ordering the entire team to deploy with the polarized goggles to prevent eye injury from projectiles or snow blindness due to the sunlight reflecting from the thick snow. As the teams rushed out of the chopper, they all started deploying to cover the area. And dropping down in pre-planned zones, they quickly re-established interlocking fields of fire. Clark and Hernandez came down the ramp at the same time with Gideon and First Lieutenant Murdoch directing the movements of Team 2, while First Sergeant Delmer and First Lieutenant Keogh directed Team 4. "We've got the north side of the clearing," said Hernandez. "I put Murdoch in charge of the south side," said Clark. "I'll be overseeing the placement of the mimic units." "Got it," said Hernandez. "We'll cover you." Hammer 2-1 climbed to the sky and banked back to the south, and Clark knew that it was already heading back to pick up another mimic unit module. Hammer 2-2 was already lining up to lay the cornerstone of the mimic placement, and if everything went according to plan, they would have the modules in place and be going online in 2 hours. The clock was now ticking. "Thunder God to Fenrir," said Clark, activating his comm. "Teams 2 and 4 are on the ground. Mimic placement is beginning. Stand by for additional instructions, over." "Solid copy, Thunder God," said Grey Eagle. "Standing by." "Fenrir, what's your status?" "Over," said Clark. "We're stable," said Grey Eagle. "No additional contact at this time, over." "Copy, Fenrir," said Clark. "Thunder God out." Snow began to kick up into the air as Hammer 2-2 began descending, bringing in the first piece of the mimic units. Lowering it into place, they cut the swing load cables loose and climbed back into the sky. Clark immediately directed his ground crew to begin removing the cables and clearing the rigging to prepare for the next section to be added. Above him, Hammer 2-3 was already moving into position. Clark continued to coordinate as unit after unit was lowered into place and secured with the locking mechanisms. Checking the status of the other units, he found that the last 4 were inbound and should be on station in 20 minutes. The ground level was all in place, and the onboard systems were already syncing up. The full system wouldn't be brought online until Teams 1 and 3 arrived in the final chopper. "Contact!" roared someone over the radio. "We've got movement in the trees." "Sound off," replied Clark. "Last call station, give your designation." "Huntsman 4-5, came in reply. "Positive contact. Subject has not attempted to close." "Huntsman 4-5, this is Broadsword," said Hernandez. "Hold your fire unless it becomes hostile. Do not engage at this time." "Copy that, Broadsword," said Huntsman 4-5. "Standing by." Clark glanced at the clipboard and saw that, per the assigned positions, Huntsman 4-5 was on the northwest corner of the clearing. Tossing the clipboard to one of the placement team, Clark pulled out his binoculars and headed around the edge of the mimics to see if he could get a view of this creature. "Thunder God to Viking," said Clark over the radio. "This is Viking," said Staff Sergeant Marcel Hendricks. "Send it over." Viking was the team's newest sniper, recently assigned to the team from the U.S. Army Green Berets. Although he was combat-proven, Clark had chosen to keep him with the team when Valkyrie had gone with Grey Eagle on the rescue. As good as he was, Valkyrie had proven to be a better shot on the range. He sent his best sniper with Fenrir because they were going to be in the middle of the fight without immediate support. "Viking," said Clark, "identify target on the northwest sector. Do not engage unless it becomes hostile." "Copy that, Thunder God," said Viking. "Acquiring target, over." "Viking," said Clark. "Be advised, silver ammunition has minimal effect. Switch to incendiary tip rounds, over." "Copy that, Thunder God," said Viking. "I'm on it, over." Clark began sweeping the area again with the binoculars. In the deep shadows beneath the trees, he could see movement, but nothing clear enough to verify the target. Whatever it was being cautious. It was getting a look at them before it made any moves. "Thunder God to Fenrir," said Clark. "Go ahead," said Grey Eagle. "The subject has approached our position," said Clark. "You should be in the clear at the moment, over." "Negative, Thunder God," said Grey Eagle. "We're still seeing movement in the trees. Subject is still on site, over." "Fenrir, interrogative," said Clark. "Can you verify? You're certain it's still there, over." "Affirm," replied Fenrir. "Subject still on site, confirmed, over." "Copy that, Fenrir," said Clark. "Stand by for further instructions. Do not attempt to move yet, over." "Copy that," said Grey Eagle. "Fenrir out." Clark took a deep breath and glanced around. And reaching into his pocket, he took out a can of chewing tobacco and put in a large pinch to soothe his nerves. "Thunder God to all units," said Clark. "Be advised there is more than one creature. Say again, there's more than one, over." "Broadsword acknowledges," said Hernandez. "Fenrir acknowledges," said Grey Eagle. In the distance, Clark could hear the rotors of incoming helicopters. Glancing in that direction, he could see the first Hammer unit returning with a mimic module beneath it. "Hammer 2-1 to Thunder God," said the radio. "Thunder God, go ahead," said Clark. "We are inbound to your position, ETA 2 minutes, said Hammer 2-1. "How copy?" "Solid copy, Hammer 2-1, said Clark. "We're ready for your arrival, over." "Huntsman 4-5 to Broadsword," said Huntsman 4-5. "Go ahead," said Hernandez. "Subject is moving off into the trees," said Huntsman 4-5. "I have lost visual. Direction of travel is northeast, over." "Copy that," said Hernandez. "All Huntsman units be advised subject is on the move, over." "Thunder God to Mjolnir," said Clark. "Go for Mjolnir," said Gideon. As soon as we're clear with the mimic placement, said Clark, come to my position. Over. Copy that, said Gideon. Over. In 15 minutes, the remaining 4 mimic modules were put into place and locked. The final Chinook landed on the snow and Teams 1 and 3 disembarked. Immediately, Team 1 headed inside the mimic units to begin bringing the systems fully online. Gideon approached Clark just as the final chopper began lifting into the air. You wanted to see me, sir? Said Gideon. Yes, said Clark. If there are more than one of these things, then we can't take it for granted that there's only 2. We have to assume several of them. That's a safe assumption, sir, said Gideon. As soon as they've got the mimics online and Team 3 is in place, said Clark, we're taking Team 2 and we're going to get the others. I won't risk them coming with just 6 of them. Good idea, said Gideon. I'll spread the word and make the preparations. Make sure everyone makes the switch to incendiaries, said Clark. Also, everyone needs to bring both gladius and tomahawks on this one. We have to be prepared for the possibilities that guns just won't work. How soon do you want to be ready? Asked Gideon. As soon as Allfather gives us the all clear, said Clark. I'll go brief him now. I want to be moving in 10 minutes. I need to have everyone back inside the wire before nightfall. Attention all units, said Major Saunders over the radio. Valhalla is online. All units, Valhalla is now online. There's my cue, said Clark, grinning. Gideon nodded and headed for the team while Clark ducked inside the mimic units. Entering the command module, Clark found Major Saunders and Command Sergeant Major Hammond checking systems. CSM Hammond was running checks on the perimeter camera systems while Saunders did a comms check with base. Wilder was at the computer console running systems checks to verify everything was working correctly. Clark, said CSM Hammond, good to see you, son. How's it look out there? CSM Hammond smiled and held out his hand, and Clark handed him a can of chewing tobacco, and the older warrior took a large pinch before handing it back. It had become a running joke with the two of them since CSN Hammond's wife wouldn't let him buy it anymore. Snowy and cold, said Clark, kind of like last time. Well, fuck, let's hope not, said Hammond. Well, we've already confirmed there's more than one creature, said Clark. No engagements since Fenrir's initial contact. How many do you think there are? Asked CSM Hammond. No idea, said Clark. 2 for certain. We have to assume there's more than that. What's on your mind, son? Asked CSM Hammond. I'm planning on taking all of Team 2 to rendezvous with Fenrir's team, said Clark. Since we know there's more than one, I thought it better to have more firepower to bring them home. A small team could get overwhelmed easily by several creatures. And you're waiting to ask Levi for permission? Asked CSM Hammond. Pretty much, said Clark. I take it your team is already prepped and ready to go, said CSM Hammond, and Clark just smiled at him. Go get your people, son, said CSM Hammond. Levi won't be off the radio for a while. I'll brief him when he's done. The quicker you get moving, the quicker you get back. Your team doesn't need to be out there once the sun goes down. Copy that, said Clark, grinning. We'll have the coffee ready when you get back, said Hammond, with a wink. Clark headed out the door and ducked through the supply module, taking the most direct path outside. He could tell that the mimics had been seriously upgraded since they last used them in Oklahoma, and it was clear that the armor was thicker and there were more modules. They had twice the number of modules than their last deployment. When Clark exited the mimic units, he saw that Team 3 was already putting in fire positions for their heavy weapons. Lieutenant Elliott was placing his team for maximum coverage of the surrounding trees. By placing the mimics in the middle of a large clearing, they had almost 50 meters of a kill zone established in every direction. Team 4 was already deploying concertina wire around the perimeter in double layers. Unless the creature could leap 10 feet in the air and cover 20 yards in a single leap, it wasn't coming through the perimeter without being noticed. All of the dog teams would be deployed inside the wire to help detect the approach of the creatures, and this time they weren't going to let the creatures get close enough to attack the mimic units directly. They were already changing their strategy for mimic deployment, and it would continue to evolve as they learned more about them. When the team formed up, Clark called the senior staff together. He met with Gideon and Lieutenant Murdoch a few feet away from the rest of the team. "All right, folks," said Clark, "we have a green light. We're going after the others, and we're moving fast, and we're taking no chances." "Where do you need us?" asked Gideon. "Murdoch," said Clark, "you take the point with Huntsman 2-1 and 2-2. We're spacing at 10-foot intervals, and everyone covers each other. Watch the trees. These things tend to try to drag prey up into the treetops. Gideon, you bring up the rear with Huntsman 2-7 and 2-8. We'll be in the middle with Runestone on the comms. Do not be drawn away from the group. We stick together, and we come back as a team." "Copy that," said Murdoch. "Gotcha, boss," said Gideon. "We're weapons hot until we're back inside the wire," said Clark. "We're clear to engage if you have a clear shot." Murdoch and Gideon both nodded and then headed off to brief their men. Clark activated his comm and stepped away from the group. "Thunder Guide to Fenrir," said Clark. "Go ahead," said Grey Eagle. "Stand by for extraction," said Clark. "We're coming to get you. Do not exit your cover until we're on site. How copy?" "Solid copy," said Grey Eagle. "We'll be watching. Over." "Be ready to move on our arrival," replied Clark. "I want to be inside the wire long before dark. Thunder God out." Heading back to the group, Clark pulled the team together and brought out his map. "All right, folks," Clark said. "We're going in after Fenrir and the others. Since we know there's more than one creature, we're not taking any chances. We are proceeding due east from here to the lake, and once we reach their ice fishing cabin, we follow the trail due north right to the cabin. Stay with the group. Do not pursue these creatures. They're deceptive and intelligent. You're clear to engage, but do not do so unless your target is confirmed. Don't be shooting at shadows." That drew a few chuckles. "All right," said Clark. "If there are no questions, let's get moving. The sun goes down early here in the winter. We're about 4 miles from the cabin, but we're not going to be moving fast, especially once we hit the trees. Now be safe and watch each other's back, and do not leave the group." "Hooah!" shouted the team. "Hooah!" replied Clark. "Murdoch, set the pace and let's move." Murdoch took his group and headed for the wire. Team 2's dog teams were on guard duty at the makeshift gate and let them through without an issue. Keeping their spacing set, Murdoch set a good pace, and fast enough to cover ground but slow enough that they were easily able to constantly sweep the surrounding trees. 30 yards past the gate they entered the thick trees. They only had about 100 yards to go before they reached the lake and were clear. While they were in the clear, they had little concern for being ambushed. However, inside the thick trees, they were inside the creature's domain, and they all knew it. Despite the sun in the sky, the woods were still shrouded in deep darkness. They were now on their own. Chapter 4. Ambush. War to the knife, and the knife to the hilt. Unknown. 12:15 hours CST, 13 February. The moment they hit the trees, the point men split, watching the trees on both sides of the trail. Moving in a crouch, the team stayed low to avoid branches. They were all prepared for the Wendigo hiding in the treetops and dragging victims to their doom. Traversing the section of woods took less than 15 minutes, but felt like much longer. Clark felt himself relaxing slightly when they passed from the darkness of the trees and back to the open as they approached the frozen lake. "Mjolnir to Thunder God," said Gideon. "Go ahead," said Clark. "We've got movement to the north," said Gideon. "It's keeping its distance, but it knows we're here. Over." "Copy that," said Clark. "All units stay alert. Thunder God out." Clark glanced to the north but didn't see any signs of movement. Valhalla to Thunder God, said Saunders. Go ahead, said Clark. Eye in the sky now going up, said Saunders. We'll relay the information as it comes in. Over. Copy that, said Clark. If you can locate the subjects, please advise. Over. Solid copy, said Saunders. Valhalla out. Ahead they could see a single ice fishing cabin on the lake. The trail they would take to the cabin was due north of that. Clark motioned for the new team sniper, Staff Sergeant Marcel Hendricks, call sign Viking, to move up beside him. Keeping his voice low, Clark began relaying instructions. When we reach the ice fishing cabin, said Clark, I want you and 2 others to stay back and set up to engage if we need to. Yes, sir, said Viking. Once you're inside the trees, I won't be able to track you. I realize that, said Clark. But what I want is to have you in place in case we have to come back on the double. Huntsman 2-4 and 2-5 can stay with you. Copy that, sir, said Viking. Clark relayed the instructions to Huntsman 2-4 and 2-5, motioning for them to remain with Viking. Valhalla actual to Thunder God, said Saunders. Go ahead, said Clark. We're tracking at least 3 motion tracks heading in your direction, said Saunders. We don't have a confirmed visual, but the movement patterns indicate large subjects. Over. Copy that, said Clark. 2 will be on the west side of the trail, said Saunders, and 1 on the east side. Understood, said Clark. Thunder God out. Covering the distance to the ice fishing cabin, Clark called for the team to stop. Viking and his 2 guards cleared off the snow from the roof of the small cabin. Once cleared, Viking climbed up and set up his firing position with a clear view of the tree line. Clark waited until they were set up and ready before giving the order to move out. Heading for the trees, they moved slowly and deliberately, waiting for any sign of the Wendigo. They could feel themselves being watched, but the creatures never made any move to show themselves. With each step they took, the air seemed to grow thicker, and the tension continued to mount. When they reached the edge of the trees, Lieutenant Murdoch crouched down and peered into the treetops. Signaling for the team to come to a stop, Murdoch took the time to study the trees before approaching. After a moment, he began moving forward in a crouch. The rest of the team slowly followed, staying low and scanning left, right, and up with each step. There was no sound coming from the trees other than the whispering of the wind through the pines. Valhalla to Thunder God, said Saunders. Go ahead, said Clark. Motion has stopped, said Saunders. We've lost track of the subjects. Over. Copy that, said Clark, proceeding with caution. Over. We'll maintain the eye in the sky and update if we see anything. Over, said Saunders. Copy, said Clark. Out. Moving into the darkness, the team continued to sweep left, right, and up with every step. Once in the trees, the silence was oppressive, with the only thing disturbing the utter stillness being the soft crunching of the boots in the snow. It took a few seconds for their eyes to adjust to the shadows, and tension was high. Clark kept his head on a swivel as he moved beneath the dark canopy. Every twig that moved in the breeze seemed magnified as he peered desperately into that darkness, looking for the threats to his team. There was a rustle of dry sticks, which was followed by an almost inaudible sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It sounded like bones tapping gently against each other. Turning his head rapidly, he zeroed in on the spot with uncanny accuracy. And there, in the deep shadows, was a shape that was nearly invisible in the gloom. It was pressed close to the side of a large tree, peering at them with just the barest slits of its eyes. It was in those bare slits that Clark caught the hint of red. "Contact left," he shouted. Snapping his rifle to his shoulder, he zeroed in the ACOG on the spot and flipped the safety snap off as he prepared to fire. And just as he was taking up the slack on the trigger, the creature moved impossibly fast. Leaping from the tree, Clark saw the figure fully silhouetted against the sparse light filtering through the treetops. It was at that moment that he saw the shimmering effect and instantly recognized what it meant. they could cloak themselves. Leading his target, Clark let fly a 3-round burst of powerful .458 SOCOM rounds. These were incendiary rounds, and he hoped that they would cause more damage than the silver rounds had. The first 2 rounds missed due to the incredible speed of the beast, but the third found its mark. Grunting in pain, the beast's trajectory was altered, and instead of landing among the branches of the large oak, it slammed into the trunk with considerable force. Several more rifles sounded as others began taking shots at the beast. Howling in pain and fury, the beast vanished into the trees and was soon lost from sight. They could still hear the odd tearing metal sound of the creature's screams as it sped off in the distance. "They can cloak!" roared Clark. "The goddamn things can cloak!" Quickly the team formed a circle with their backs toward one another and began scanning the trees around them. They all had their weapons up and were scanning for targets, and with the knowledge that the creatures could virtually turn themselves invisible, every shadow and shape had to be studied closely. The threat level was now incredibly higher than they had expected. None of the legends had suggested that the creatures could cloak. "Valhalla to Thunder God," said Saunders over the radio. "Go," said Clark, not taking his eyes off their surroundings. "The drone detected gunfire and movement," said Saunders. "What's your status, over?" "We engaged one creature and it fled," said Clark. "One hit confirmed, but more possible, over." "To what effect?" asked Saunders, over. "The incendiaries heard it," said Clark, "but not enough to put it down, over." "We're still tracking the movement," said Saunders. "Whatever you did, it's clearing the area as fast as it can, over." "Monitor where it goes," said Clark. "It might lead us to its lair, over." "Copy that," said Saunders. Out. They continued to watch the trees for several minutes without anything else presenting itself, and Clark glanced around and above them before making his decision. They were burning daylight, and this was now the last place he wanted to be when the sun went down. With the creature's cloaking ability, finding it at night would be almost impossible without using thermal imaging, and no guarantee it would work against them. "Stay sharp, folks," he said. "Let's get moving." The team started moving again, cautiously watching every shadow and tree. Murdoch took point with his 2 escorts flanking him. They were approaching a thick stand of pine trees when Clark saw Murdoch's hand go up, giving the signal to stop. The team froze instantly, and Clark could hear the creaking of gloves tightening on the handles of weapons. The team knelt into the snow and brought their weapons up, covering every angle of approach. Murdoch turned and made eye contact with Clark, and then held up 2 fingers, pointing at his own eyes. He'd seen something. Motioning for Clark to come up to him, Murdoch turned back toward the stand of trees and brought his weapon up to a ready position. Clark made his way up to Murdoch and knelt beside him. "What do you got?" whispered Clark. Pointing ahead, Murdoch leaned close to keep his voice as low as possible. "I see blood ahead," said Murdoch. "There's quite a bit of it on the ground near the base of the tree." "Well, that's probably where they were attacked," whispered Clark. "Do you see any movement?" "No," replied Murdoch, "but that's a perfect ambush spot. It's darker than the surrounding trees, and it's where it was waiting for the men that were attacked. We won't be able to see it in there." "If we go off trail," said Clark, "it's going to slow us down. We might not make it back before dark." "Well, if we go through there," said Murdoch, "we might not make it back at all." "The map doesn't show how big this section is," said Clark. "We've got no way to know how far we'll have to go to avoid it." "Well, therein lies the rub," said Murdoch. "We walk into a possible ambush, or we chance not getting back before dark. Hell of a choice to have to make. I'm glad you're the one that's got to make it, sir." "Well, gee, thanks," said Clark. "Seriously, though," said Murdoch, "we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. Unless you've got another solution I'm not considering." Well, Clark thought for a moment, considering all available information. He knew that a decision had to be made quickly because they were wasting daylight with every passing second. "We go through," said Clark, frowning. Turning to the team, he motioned for them to get where they could hear him. "All right, folks," he began. "We're going through an area where an ambush is highly possible." Everyone nodded as they glanced behind him toward the thick pines. "Load your grenade launchers," said Clark. "It might not kill one, but I bet it gets his attention. And from that point, we're at free fire. If you see it, engage it." There were 8 of them that had the underbarrel mounted M320 grenade launchers, including Gideon and Clark. They all quickly loaded their launcher tubes and readied them for use. "Let's move," said Clark. Murdoch nodded and headed back to the point position, and crouching low, he crept into the trees and swept every direction. The team closed the distance, keeping within arm's reach of the next person. This made it easier to respond to anyone who'd been attacked. Clark constantly swept the trees as he moved beneath them. Just ahead of him was the team communications specialist, Senior Chief Petty Officer Santana Alvarez, codename Runestone. He was recruited into the hunt from the U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 and had been with the team for almost 2 years. Runestone was watching the trees and providing cover when they all heard the radio hiss with a garbled communication. As Runestone shifted his attention to try to clear up the signal, there was a sudden rush of movement from directly above him. Hidden among the branches, a Wendigo slashed downwards, cutting into Runestone's vest and face. Before the creature could attempt to drag him up into the trees, Clark shot it in the neck at almost point-blank range with his rifle. The massive .458 SOCOM round slammed into the beast with tremendous force. It dropped Runestone, and the beast fell to the ground, shrieking in pain and rage. The multi-tone tearing metal sound was painful to everyone around the beast from both the tone and volume of the screen. Ignoring the pain, Clark shot it twice more in the chest, and the shriek stopped almost immediately. Looking down at the smoking wounds in the beast's torso, Clark could see that the incendiary rounds were causing massive damage, but he couldn't tell if the creature was alive or dead. Not taking any chances, he shot it once more in the head. The force knocked the skull face off the head. It wasn't part of the creature. It was the skull of an elk that had been crafted into a mask. The features beneath the mask were horrifying. It was clear that it had once been human. The skin was leathery and drawn tight over the bones of the skull, and the lips looked like they had been ripped or chewed off. The bluish-purple tongue lolled out of the mouth and seemed to have strange pustules on it. There was a tattoo over the thing's left eye. The skin was withered, but you could still make out the details of the tattoo. It was a blackbird's wing that covered one eye. "Looks like the incendiary rounds will put one down," said Clark. Runestone was on the ground, his hand cradling the deep laceration to the left side of his face. The newest medic on the team, Staff Sergeant Norman Meredith, codenamed Caduceus, immediately ran over to Runestone to start first aid. Caduceus had been recruited in January at the team tryouts in Washington and came to the team from the U.S. Army Green Berets. The rest of the team formed a defensive perimeter around the wounded man and brought their weapons up. Clark continued to watch the beast on the ground, still unsure if it was dead. There was massive trauma to the head and chest cavity, but the creature was not natural. It was a supernatural creature, and there was no way to know if it was going to stay down or for how long. "Gideon," said Clark, loud enough to be heard. Gideon moved over next to Clark and kept his weapon trained on the creature. "What's up, boss?" asked Gideon. "Do you have any thermite in your pack?" asked Clark. "I think so," said Gideon, taking off his pack and checking. "What have you got in mind?" "One of the books said that you had to cut out its icy heart and burn it," said Clark. "I think a thermite grenade placed in the chest should burn anything in the area." "That it might," said Gideon, grinning. "Here you go, sir." Gideon slipped his pack back on and then resumed covering the creature in case it tried to get up. "Caduceus," said Clark, "how's Runestone?" He's going to need quite a few stitches, sir, said Caduceus. He won't be winning any beauty pageants, and he's going to have a hell of a scar, but he'll live. Can he be moved? Asked Clark. I've got pressure on the wound now, said Caduceus. We need to get that stitched up as soon as possible. Can we make it to the cabin? Asked Clark. We're sitting ducks here. I can make it, sir, said Runestone. Give me 2 minutes and I can close it with superglue, said Caduceus. It's going to hurt like a bastard, though. Do it, said Runestone. 2 minutes, said Clark. Caduceus set to the task of cleaning out the wounds with peroxide and then beginning the process of closing them with a tube of medical adhesive. To his credit, Runestone barely made a sound during the entire process. Done, said Caduceus. It needs to be double-checked once we're in the clear, but he's mobile. All right, folks, said Clark. Let's get moving. Murdoch took point again, and they headed deeper into the thick pines. Once the team was moving, Clark pulled a pin on the thermite grenade and stuffed it into one of the open wounds in the middle of the creature's chest. Fry, motherfucker, whispered Clark. They moved away, heading off into the trees when the thermite ignited. The creature began flailing and screaming again. It hadn't been dead the entire time. Digging at its chest, it tried in vain to pull the burning thermite from its chest, catching its hands on fire in the process. As the bright glow engulfed the creature's entire torso, it burst into flames. The shriek of pain died away as the creature became completely immolated in flames. In the trees around them, they heard at least 4 more shrieks as other creatures sounded their fury at the death of one of their own. One of them would get closer, and as the dying creature's screams ceased, they could hear the creatures moving off at a high rate of speed. They had just been put on notice. The humans could kill them now. The game had just significantly changed. Despite the creatures moving away, the team did not let its guard down. From the roars and screams of the creatures as they fled the area, they knew this was not over. In fact, it was far from over. They were going to be back, and they were coming back for blood. As they moved deeper into the trees, Murdoch called for them to come to a stop. Clark could see Murdoch step off the trail and then return holding an AR-style rifle. It had been nearly snapped in half at the magazine well, but was held together by a single section of the aluminum lower receiver. Murdoch reached up and put the remains of the rifle in the pack of Huntsman 2-2, and once it was secure, they continued through the trees. They passed 2 spots where there had been a great deal of blood spilled in the snow, and they didn't find any bodies or even pieces. The creatures were very thorough at taking everything they could eat. Motioning for Clark to approach her, the other team medic was crouched beside a pool of blood. Staff Sergeant Samantha Pennebaker, codenamed Shield Maiden, had come to the team before Clark had and was originally in the U.S. Air Force pararescue teams. "What do you have?" asked Clark, kneeling beside her. "This spot here," she said, pointing. "It's blood," said Clark. "What about it?" "I can see the impressions in the snow where one of the men fell," said Shield Maiden. "Okay, so what's the problem?" asked Clark. "Sorry, but I don't follow." "There's not enough blood here to have been fatal," said Shield Maiden. "I think he was alive when he was dragged away." "I believe that would have been a guy named Sheffield," said Clark. "Fenrir told me that he was the only one that was taken out but not confirmed dead." "Then I would guess that he's still alive," said Shield Maiden. "Or at least, he was when he was taken. There was something in one of the legends that suggested they occasionally took people alive to eat later," said Clark, "like stocking food for a long winter." "Then unless they've eaten him since then," said Shield Maiden. "There's a chance he might still be alive," finished Clark. "If there's a chance, then we have to try to find him." "Yes, sir," said Shield Maiden, smiling. "Leave no man behind," said Clark, heading back to the group. "And that's why we like you, sir," whispered Shield Maiden. Taking her place back in the formation, they continued through the trees. As they rounded a bend in the trail, a cabin emerged from the darkness, and they could see light again. Moments later, they all entered the clearing and headed for the front porch. "Thunder God to Fenrir," said Clark. "Go ahead," said Grey Eagle. "We're on your front lawn," said Clark. "We've got a wounded man. Let's get him inside so he can get patched up before we head back, over." "Solid copy, Thunder God," said Grey Eagle. "We're coming out, over." "Copy that," said Clark. "Out. Break. Thunder God to Valhalla." "Go ahead," said a voice Clark didn't recognize. He knew it had to be one of the new combat controllers that had been brought on board from the Air Force. "We've reached Objective 1, said Clark. "Nothing additional, over." "Copy, Thunder God. Valhalla out." The door to the cabin opened and Grey Eagle walked out onto the porch. "We put on some coffee," said Grey Eagle. "Who's hurt?" A man Clark didn't recognize came walking out in a team uniform. "Captain Clark," said Grey Eagle, "this is Kerry Davis. We all called him Pocket Doc, Doc for short, when the crap hit the fan." "This is the guy from Dark Angel, right?" said Clark. "That's me," said Doc. "Well," said Clark, "I've got a story to tell you. I'm alive because of your kits. It's damn good to meet you, sir." "Glad to be of service," said Doc. "Now, how can I help? I heard you have a man wounded." Caduceus headed inside leading Runestone, and Doc and Shield Maiden went with him. "I think they've got this," said Grey Eagle. "I'm still getting to know Caduceus," said Clark, "but he seems solid. I think there aren't many wounds that those three can't treat." "Well, let's hope we don't have to find out, sir," said Grey Eagle. While the medics patched up Runestone's face, Clark brought everyone up to speed on what they'd learned thus far. They now knew that fire would kill a Wendigo. The trick was putting them down long enough to burn them. That was going to prove to be the most difficult part. Chapter 5. Darkness Falls. Live for something rather than die for nothing. General George S. Patton. 14:45 hours CST, 13 February. Runestone walked out of the cabin with a large bandage on his face. He gave Clark a thumbs up and started putting his gear back on. Doc, Shield Maiden, and Caduceus emerged behind him and stood on the porch. Clark headed over to them and stopped a few feet away. "How is he?" asked Clark. "Well, we cleaned him up," said Shield Maiden. "He had 3 nasty gashes on the left cheek and on his neck." "We found a piece of claw embedded in his neck," said Caduceus. "That would have caused a hell of an infection if we hadn't found it." "Over 60 stitches to close it up properly," said Doc. "He's going to have a couple of interesting scars, but he'll heal." "Good," said Clark. "Grab your gear and get ready to move. We're rapidly burning daylight." With that, everyone started grabbing their packs and double-checking their gear. Weapons were checked and magazines were replenished so that everyone was operating with full ammo. And while Clark was checking the map, Doc approached him and stood to his left. "Something I can do for you?" asked Clark, not looking up from the map. "I heard you think Sheffield might be alive," said Doc. "We think so," said Clark. "We have no way to know for sure, but it looks like he was taken alive." "I want to be part of the team that goes after him," said Doc adamantly. "Grey Eagle speaks highly of you," said Clark, smiling. "He says you would have been someone we recruited, but he's scared of your wife." "Hell, I am too," said Doc, chuckling. "She'd never go for it, but I certainly appreciate the thought." "Well, I have faith in Grey Eagle," said Clark. "If he says you're capable, then I believe him. The thing is, you aren't even supposed to know this team exists. We're about 4 steps above top secret." "I've held clearances before," said Doc. "Then I don't need to remind you of the danger in revealing the existence of this team," said Clark. "Do I?" "Not at all," said Doc. "Besides, who the hell would believe me? If I start talking about seeing dogmen and Wendigo, they'd book me a room in the Hotel Twinkie and give me one of those fancy jackets that lace up in the back." "Well, that's a good point," said Clark. "Greg will trust you, and I trust him. You're in for the duration. If there's any shit to take over it, I'll take it. If it was my friend out there, I'd want to be part of the rescue mission too. Well, I owe him that, said Doc. I won't leave knowing he might still be out there. Then I'm going to expect you to act like a member of this team, said Clark. That means following orders like everyone else. It's your team, said Doc. You lead, I'll follow. Good, said Clark. Welcome to Team Odin. Do you mind if I ask more information than that? Asked Doc. I think you probably know too much as it is, said Clark with a grin. Once we get back to Valhalla, I'll give you the highlights. What's Valhalla? Said Doc. You'll see, said Clark, chuckling. As I said, you probably already know too much. Gideon came up beside them. Sorry to interrupt, boss, said Gideon, but we need to get moving. We've only got a few hours of daylight left. We didn't pack NVGs. Get the team ready, said Clark. Same positions. Keep Kodiak on rear guard with you, and Grey Eagle goes on point with Murdoch. The rest to the middle. I'm on it, boss, said Gideon. I'll make it happen. When do you want to leave? Be ready in 5, said Clark. Gideon nodded and headed out at a quick pace. Your sergeant major seems like a solid guy, said Doc. Gideon? Said Clark. Yeah, he's a hell of a soldier. Just got promoted to sergeant major last month. Frankly, he earned it a long time ago. They've been bouncing it around since Oklahoma, and I'm glad he finally got it. Clark turned to check his gear and the radio came to life. Valhalla controlled a Thunder God, said a female voice he didn't recognize. Go for Thunder God, said Clark. Thunder God, we have a shift in weather patterns, said the voice. A storm that was north of our position has shifted directions and is heading our way. Over. Copy, said Clark. How long until it hits? Over. If it maintains current speed, said the voice, we anticipate 2 hours at the most. Solid copy, Valhalla, said Clark. We're going to be heading back. Please advise if there's any change in the weather. Over. Copy, said the voice. Valhalla out. Gideon, yelled Clark. We're moving. The team began grabbing gear and checking weapons as they began stacking in position. They were in position in less than 30 seconds. Every person double-checked the people around them. No one wanted to leave any gear behind, and Clark held up his thumb, and one by one, the rest of the team followed. Once every thumb was up, Clark nodded at Murdoch. Set the pace, Lieutenant, Clark said. We need to cover some ground as quickly as we can. We've got a storm inbound. Murdoch nodded and headed into the trees. Grey Eagle locked his eyes with Clark for a brief moment, and then nodded and followed Murdoch. As the team started moving into the trees, Valkyrie took her position beside Clark and matched his pace. Good to have you back, Valkyrie, said Clark with a grin. Glad to be back, sir, she said, nodding. If you're going after the possible survivor, I'm going with you. Never doubted that for a second, said Clark without glancing her way. As they entered the trees, training took over, and they both began sweeping every angle of approach. Valkyrie had slung her sniper rifle over her back and was using one of the custom-made HK UMP-50s that the team armorer had crafted for the team. It was a standard military version of the HK UMP-45, but rechambered to fire Guncrafter Industries 50 GI bullets. The team snipers carried them as backup weapons, and the dog handlers carried them as a primary weapon. Murdoch was setting a rapid pace, and it was only a matter of minutes before they were passing the charred remains of the dead Wendigo. The fire had burned all the flesh away and left behind an odd skull mask. It was an elk skull that had been modified to wear. There were even crude leather straps attached so it could be tied to the creature's head. Margolin picked up the mask and looked into the empty sockets. Damn, said Margolin. That thermalite did a hell of a job. There's scorch marks all over it. Was this the thing's skull or just a mask? I think it was just a mask, said Clark. Put that thing down, you moron, said Valkyrie. Hell no, said Margolin. The captain took this bastard out, and I'm putting this on the wall at Steve's place. Clark just shook his head. You could tell him to leave it alone, said Valkyrie to Clark, grinning. And listen to him bitch all the way back, said Clark, returning the grin. Besides, if he hangs it there, no one would believe what it was anyway. Yeah, but we'll know, said Valkyrie. Well, that's the important part, said Clark. The passage back through the trees didn't seem to take near as long as the trip through, and when they started getting glimpses of the lake ahead, Clark activated his radio. Thunder God to Viking, said Clark. Viking here, replied Viking. Go ahead. We're approaching your position, said Clark. Over. Copy that, said Viking. I see you. Over. We're coming to you, said Clark. Thunder God out. As they emerged back out into the clearing and onto the lake, they saw Viking still panning the trees behind them with his scope. You're all clear, Thunder God, said Viking. I see no signs of pursuit. Over. Copy, said Clark. Out. Once they were clear of the trees and in the open, Clark could see the dark clouds forming in the north. He feared that they would get more snow, like the blizzard they'd faced in Oklahoma. And then he saw the lightning flashing through the clouds. Shit, he hissed. It's a thunderstorm. Don't tell me the Thunder God is worried about a little thunderstorm, said Valkyrie, suppressing a chuckle. You do realize, said Clark, grinning, that Thunder God is a code name, right? I don't have a magic hammer and I can't control the weather. I'm no god unless it's of scars and bad decisions. Well, I know what to get for you for your birthday, she replied with a smile. I'm more worried about the rain turning to ice once the temperature drops, said Clark. Ice makes everything worse. Thunder rolled across the frozen lake, echoing off into the distance. The promise of the storm hung heavily in the air. Clark could feel the electricity growing in the air, and there was something oddly unnatural about this storm. There's an ill feeling in this storm, said Grey Eagle as he approached. Can the Wendigo control the weather? Asked Clark. In some versions of legend, yes, said Grey Eagle. And in some versions, it cannot be killed by anything but silver. Some say not at all. The fact that you killed one with fire is a testament to their vulnerability. Yeah, thermite did the trick, said Clark, but knocking it down to use it was the real trick. Those things can take a beating. The silver bullets we made for your team won't work on it, said Grey Eagle. They have to be pure silver to have real effect on the Wendigo. This is a far more powerful creature than you've ever faced before. Well, that explains why the bullets had only limited effect, said Clark. We took out one, but that was as much luck as anything. We have no idea how many are there. I noticed that about the bullets as well, said Grey Eagle. Perhaps we can get the armorer to make some when we get back. If he has the silver to do it, said Clark. That's not normally something we keep with us. Fortunately, all of our blades are etched with pure silver. Then they should be effective, said Grey Eagle. Are the tomahawks also etched with silver? Yeah, said Clark. We had all the edged weapons done that way. Even my combat knife is etched. Good, said Grey Eagle. However, if the Wendigo is controlling the weather, we should expect it to attack during the storm. We should get inside the perimeter as fast as we can. I agree, said Clark. Let's get moving. The team began forming back up for the last leg of the journey back to Valhalla, and since they were no longer in the trees, Murdoch set a rapid pace, retracing their steps. Help me, called a voice from the woods. That's Sheffield, yelled Doc. Help me, Carrie, called the voice. Doc looked confused. What's going on? He asked, glancing around. What do you mean? Asked Clark. That's Sheffield's voice, but he never calls me by my first name, said Doc. He always calls me Doc. He thinks it's funny to say, What's up, Doc, all the time. The Wendigo could not know that, said Grey Eagle. It can mimic voices, but it cannot read minds. Then how did it know my name? Asked Doc. That's the real question, said Clark, but one thing is for certain. We're not going after that voice. It's trying to lure you into a trap. Boss, said Gideon, you might want to take a look at this. Clark turned toward Gideon to find the older warrior looking at the approaching clouds. And looking up, Clark saw it. There in the leading clouds was the unmistakable shape of a Wendigo's face. It was plain to see with the lightning illuminating the clouds behind it. "Well, fuck me," said Margolin. "How's it doing that?" "The Wendigo are creatures of dark magic," said Grey Eagle. "Who knows what they're capable of?" "We need to get moving," said Clark. "Murdoch, get us going." As the teams headed out, Grey Eagle moved up beside Clark. "If they're controlling the weather, as we believe," said Grey Eagle, "then there's one actively controlling it. Like a shaman of my people, one will be summoning the storm." "Well, if he's outside, we can find him," said Clark. Nodding, Grey Eagle headed back to his position in the formation. "Thunder God to Valhalla," said Clark. "This is Valhalla Control," said a female voice. "I need Valhalla Actual, over," said Clark. "Go ahead," said Saunders. "Do we still have the eye in the sky?" asked Clark. "Affirm," said Saunders. "What do you need?" "Have it look for one of the creatures standing in the open," said Clark, "possibly near a fire or on a hill." "Copy," said Saunders. "I'm assuming you'll explain why later." "Affirmative," said Clark. "Can you locate, over?" "That's affirmative," said Saunders. "We have 4 clicks northwest of your current position, standing in the open on a hilltop, over." "Is the drone armed?" asked Clark. "Negative," said Saunders. "All of our drones are too small to be armed, over." "Is there any chance we can get one called in?" asked Clark, over. To their astonishment, another voice cut into the channel. "This is Asgard Actual," said the voice. "We have an asset not far from your position. It can be on station in 10 minutes. "Copy, Asgard Actual," said Saunders. "We'll have our eye in the sky, paint the target, over." "Understood, Valhalla," said Asgard. "Asset can give you 1 pass, and it has to return to its assigned sector, over." "Thank you, Asgard," said Saunders. "Solid copy, Valhalla," said Asgard. "Looking forward to reading this mission report. Asgard Actual, out." "Who the hell is Asgard Actual?" asked Valkyrie, looking wide-eyed at Clark. "Asgard Actual is none other than Lieutenant General Joshua Dalton himself," said Clark. "Why is he monitoring our radio communications?" asked Valkyrie. "Because he can, I suppose," said Clark. "But that's not what bothers me." "What's that?" asked Valkyrie. "Why do we have an armed asset in the air above U.S. soil, less than 10 minutes from northern Minnesota?" "Well, we may never know the answer to that, sir," said Valkyrie. "Yeah, you're probably right," said Clark. Turning back to the team, Clark cupped his hands around his mouth. "Team 2!" roared Clark. "Move!" The team increased speed and quickly covered the distance to the trees. Glancing at his watch, Clark knew that whatever the asset was, it should be coming in very soon. He looked up into the sky, and Clark saw a Predator drone break from the clouds and streak over their heads at an altitude of about 1,000 feet. "Fuck me," said Margolin. "Was that a goddamn Predator drone?" "Yes, it was," said Clark. Seconds later, they heard the whoosh of a Hellfire missile launching, followed by an explosion. As the Predator drone banked back over their heads and headed back into the clouds, they saw the fireball rolling into the sky to the northwest. "Valhalla Actual to Thunder God," said Saunders. "Target is destroyed. Say again, target is destroyed, over." "Copy, we're RTB, over," said Clark. "Copy," said Saunders. "See you inside the wire. Valhalla out." "Check the clouds," said Valkyrie. Clark turned back to see the face of the Wendigo blowing away like smoke in a strong wind. The intensity of the storm seemed to be fading as well, although it was still coming toward them. "Well, the storm is weakening, but it's still coming," said Clark. "Those dark clouds are going to cover the sun. It's going to get dark soon." "How soon?" asked Valkyrie. "Not long," said Clark. "Half an hour at the most." "Then we need to get inside the wire," said Valkyrie. Murdoch hit the trees at the end of the lake and didn't slow down. They crouched and covered every angle, but they were pushing hard to hit the wire. Clark scanned the trees for any sign of movement, but he saw nothing, and 30 seconds later, he entered the trees. Margolin panned upwards and turned a full circle as he kept moving, and Clark followed his search but saw nothing in the canopy. Nothing was moving, and no shape stood out. "Is everything okay?" Clark asked Margolin. "Yeah," said Margolin. "Just had a funny feeling, that's all." Turning back to the team, they continued through the trees, and seconds later they emerged from the woods and headed for the gate. Glancing back, Clark caught a faint shimmer in the trees with a brief flash of red eyes. There had been at least one watching them the entire time. "Son of a bitch," whispered Clark. You are listening to Codename Wild Hunt, Curse of the Wendigo. Written by D.A. Roberts. Read to you by Cameron Buckner. Print copyright by Douglas Roberts. Audio production copyright by Cameron Buckner. Reproduction of this audio in any way is prohibited by U.S. copyright laws without written approval. Stay tuned to the Dixie Cryptid channel for Book 3, Codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle.